Welcome, everybody. I'm looking forward to the presentation. My career was as a CPA. For many years, I worked for a large international accounting firm. And when I left that, I spent about 20 years working with families, particularly individuals who were diagnosed with chronic or terminal illnesses. So I've worked with people with everything from Alzheimer's disease to Lou Gehrig's disease, Parkinson's, all with the idea of helping the family adjust their financial plan based on the diagnosis. Now, I also have some personal experience, particularly with Alzheimer's and dementia. My older brother, Rick, died of Alzheimer's disease just about 2.5 years ago. He lived in Kansas City. He had a PhD in economics. He worked for the Federal Reserve. And suddenly one day my sister-in-law called, and she was concerned about his inability to follow conversations, remember what she had said, and we were going to a family reunion. I grew up in a family. I have 3 sisters and 2 brothers, so there's 6 of us. And she asked us to pay attention whether or not we thought Rick was struggling with his memory issues. I think most of us decided, yes, Rick was having problems. He was eventually diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. And I think from the time he was diagnosed to his death was about 2.5 or 3 years. So it was fairly quick. I also had a older sister who died of a dementia, or not of a dementia. She died with a dementia called Binswanger's. I used to tease her that we all come from Wisconsin. I told her Binswanger's doesn't sound like a dementia. It sounds more like a bratwurst that we'd buy in Wisconsin. But it is a vascular dementia. I think from diagnosis to death was about 5 years. But in this case, Kathy did not die of dementia. She died of choking on a sandwich. She was at lunch. The nurse had left her alone too long. She was at a nursing facility, and she started to choke, as most of you may know. When you have a dementia, particularly Alzheimer's, you begin to lose your higher functions first, and your most basic functions, like swallowing, you lose last. And that's what happened to Kathy. So she began choking. By the time they unobstructed her airway, she had lost more oxygen, and the doctor suggested, given the amount of oxygen she lost, that it was probably better to remove the life support equipment, which my brother-in-law and my niece and 2 nephews decided to do. So Kathy died probably in 2020 of a dementia, or with a dementia. So I've had experience both personally with my family and also with a lot of the clients I've worked with. With Alzheimer's, I always focus on, I think what we've learned lately is that Alzheimer's begins affecting us long before the clinical symptoms are readily apparent. So in the outline I sent to you, the key takeaways, I start out with a quote that came recently based on some studies that were done in the December 2024 issue of our bulletin. It says, unpaid bills, lower credit scores, and shrinking net worth Years before people are diagnosed with dementia or other cognitive impairment, they often have difficulty managing money and start suffering financially. And I found this time and time again where I've talked to families where now looking back on it, they could see where their family member was starting to lose his financial skills. In my brother's case, with his PhD in economics, he was best known in his field for his work with statistics. And when other professors or economists would call him, he was just very good at mathematics and statistics. And that was, to me, the most heartbreaking thing that Rick went through. Near the end of his life, I had to talk and in very basic terms about addition, subtraction. He had lost almost all of his sophisticated ability to do mathematics. And as some of you and with your family members know, it becomes heartbreaking to see them lose what they were so good at before the disease and the clinical symptoms began. So understanding that Alzheimer's disease can impact long before the clinical symptoms, I think is important to our discussion today. I'm also a believer that there is no such thing as long-term care planning. Care planning is a continuum. You do it from the time you, say, retire at age 65 and go on Medicare, some cases even before that. And it just increases in scope and in planning needs as you get older. I have two clients right now, Novilla, who lives in Florida, and she is just under age 65, but she's on disability. In November, she had been receiving Social Security disability income, and that support was discontinued. She didn't know why, and she contacted me through a nonprofit agency I worked through to help her figure out what happened. And then in January, her coverage under Medicare ended. To make matters worse, in late January, she was diagnosed with cancer. So now she was diagnosed with cancer. She had no Medicare coverage, so no medical coverage, and she was not receiving her Social Security disability income. So what we had to do was work through the Social Security Administration and find out why her coverage ended, and then get those coverages reinstated. Otherwise, she would have procedures done, and she had them done in February that she had no coverage for. But we were able to get her Medicare restarted on February 1st, and also her Social Security disability income. And she was also, and this is something we'll talk about in a little bit, duly eligible. That's a key term. If many people are on Medicare, as Novilla was, in this case because she was disabled, but because she was also impoverished, she was duly eligible for Medicare and Medicaid. What did that do for her? Medicare covers you for certain medical expenses, but it doesn't cover all your expenses. You have co-pays, you have co-insurance. Part B of Medicare, which covers doctor office visits, costs $185 a month premium. So you can imagine if you're impoverished, that's money that you can't afford or you don't have. But because Novilla is duly eligible in Florida, Medicare, she's covered by Medicare. Medicaid steps in to pay all those extra costs she has to pay for being in Medicare. So the Part B premium for her of $185 a month in 2025 is covered. Her co-payments and co-insurance for Medicare expenses are covered, and for her prescription drug coverage, there's a program called the Low Income Subsidy, or it's also called Extra Help, which a lot of people don't know about, but it helps you pay all those co-insurance, co-pays, and premiums that come with Medicare Part D prescription drug coverage. So we're going to talk about being dually eligible in a little bit, but it's a term that a lot of people are not familiar with and a lot of people do not take advantage of. I have another client called Luda. Well, that's her shortened name. She is actually from Lithuania. She emigrated from Lithuania maybe 25 years ago when she was 40 with her husband. And Luda had a series of strokes when she was in her late 50s. Now, strokes, for those of you who don't know, actually impacted Luda because it decreased her ability to speak her second language. In this case, English is her second language. So when I first began working with her, we had to find a Lithuanian nurse because her ability with English was slowly decreasing. In the southwest suburbs of Chicago, you may or may not know this, there is a large Lithuanian population. So finding a Lithuanian speaker is not that difficult. Now with Luda, she was covered for the strokes. Later on, last year, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. She had a mastectomy last year. She also had radiation treatment, which weakened her bones. She fell and broke her hip. So she had a horrendous year last year in terms of her medical needs. And then in talking to her, one of the things she had done was signed up for Social Security. Unfortunately, she did it on her own. She didn't realize that she went on Social Security just on her own work record. She was actually entitled to Social Security to a spousal benefit based on her husband's work record. Now, what did that mean to Luda? It meant that by applying for the spousal benefit, her monthly Social Security amount went from $361 up to $562. So it added $200 to her monthly income, which to them on their tight budget was a blessing. In addition, Social Security paid her for 15 months of back spousal Social Security income, which amounted to about $3,000. So in 2025, we were able to improve Luda's cash flow by about $5,000. And also her Medicare coverage, because of her diagnosis of cancer in 2024, we actually made a change to that. And my point is this: whether you have Alzheimer's disease, a cancer, care planning is an important part of what you're going to do. We'll talk about long-term planning, but as I said, I think care planning is something we all should do as soon as you reach, at least as soon as you reach Medicare age. In some cases, like with Luda's story and Novella, they were eligible for Medicare early because of disabilities. But when you add you add something like Alzheimer's disease, the difficulty there, as I mentioned, is that the disease actually begins to impact you long before you're actually diagnosed with Alzheimer's. With my brother's case, I think they estimate, and my brother was fortunate in a way. My sister-in-law had advanced degrees in public health and taught at the Kansas University Medical School. So she had access to doctors who worked on research in Alzheimer's area. So he was lucky because of her knowledge of the doctors. But that's what I find out from a lot of my clients. Part of the challenge of having a chronic or terminal illness is finding the doctors you work best with. We won't talk about that much because we don't have time during the session, but finding the right doctor, a doctor you're comfortable with, you feel is being honest with you, is a big part of struggling with a chronic or terminal illness. In other cases, dementias, I had a client who was a very well-known attorney in Chicago. He was 51 years old, and he had what's called frontal temporal dementia. That is a vascular dementia that impacts the front part of the brain. And for an attorney, as you can imagine, the frontal temporal dementia impacts all those skills you need to be an effective attorney: communication skills, organization skills, fighting for your client. And FTD attacks all of those qualities and made it harder every day for Mark to practice his profession. He eventually, about a year ago, closed his practice. And what I did for Mark, when you are diagnosed with this type of chronic illness, terminal illness, it's important that we sit down and redo your financial plan given the diagnosis you've had. So with Mark, we sat down as he closed up his practice, and we again look at his future income streams, his assets, and decided how is he going to deal with the costs of the disease, and what are his plans. Unfortunately, his life expectancy with FTD is about 5 or 6 years. So he and his wife were considering moving either down to Arizona or to Florida to spend Mark's last years. And I haven't made a decision yet, but organizing Mark's finances in light of the disease is something we're going to talk about in a little more right now. I had met Tessa, or when she was called, when a social worker had her call me. Tessa had sold her home in Champaign. She worked down at the University of Illinois at Urbana, moved up to the southwest suburbs. Her mom had Alzheimer's disease. Her mom was also deep into Alzheimer's. She got to the point where she really couldn't live alone. So Tess sold her home, moved up to be with her mom. Her dad had died several years earlier, and she was an only child. So Tess is the only real caregiver available for her mom. So she moved up. Tess and I met, and we did several things. First of all, we met and talked about her mom's budget. What was her mom's income? What were her expenses? What did Tess need to know in order to become the financial caregiver? Not surprisingly, because this is typically the case, most adult kids don't know much about their parents' finances. So we went through that. In many ways, Tess's mom was fortunate. She owned their home. She had small Social Security income amount that was paid monthly, and a small pension that her dad, Tess's dad, had earned while he worked. And so she had not a lot of income, but enough to be reasonably comfortable. What she couldn't do was really live on her own. That had become dangerous. So Tess moved up to the southwest suburbs. We reviewed Tessa's mom's income and expense budget, figuring out how much she would need, whether or not she could afford to move from her home to a care facility, which her mom did not want to do. So we wanted to figure out, could we keep her home? One of the things I put Tess in touch with, there is a state of Illinois program that will pay family members to care for a loved one who has Alzheimer's disease. It's kind of it's kind of a win-win proposition. Illinois wins because they pay less by keeping the person at home than by moving them to a nursing home. It's a win for the patient because he or she is cared for by a family member after he or she is trained. And the family member gets paid. I don't know what the rate is now, but maybe around $20 an hour to be able to stay at home and care for their family member. In different parts of the state, Catholic Charity runs this program for the state. So you can contact them if you're interested. So that's the first thing we did with Tess. We made her familiar with her mom's income, her financial position, her monthly expenses. The other thing I talked to her about, because this was just last July, it's a program that I'm very excited about that the Alzheimer's Association is doing in conjunction with a company called Ripple Care, RIPPLCARE.com. This is a pilot program being run by Medicare that's available to support the caregiver who is at home caring for their family member. To me, I think it's a wonderful program. It has been rolled out in Illinois and a couple of other states in 2024. More states are going to see the program rolled out this year. But the Ripple program is actually paid for by Medicare. So what does the Ripple program do? It puts you in touch with a nurse practitioner who will help oversee the home care of your family member. There's a respite benefit to it, meaning they'll send in someone to take care of your family member while you take a break from caregiving. I think the benefit is up to $2,500 a year. They will also arrange for other services to be brought into your home to support the caregiver. Not all is paid for by Medicare, but much of it is. Now, the one aspect that's disappointing about the program is that only if you're in traditional Medicare is the Ripple program available to you. If you're in a Medicare Advantage plan and you call Ripple, you'll have to pay the cost yourself. If you're in traditional Medicare, meaning parts A and B, Ripple's program will be paid for by Medicare Part B. Now, Medicare Part B normally requires the beneficiary to pay 20% of the cost. But in this case, because it's a pilot program, the 20% copayment or coinsurance is waived, and you get access to many of the Ripple benefits without any money being paid out of pocket. So if you go to Ripple Care, RIPPLCARE.com/, they have people you can talk to, and you can see if you're eligible for the program. And if you're eligible, they'll take you through the steps you need to go through, and eventually their services are all provided through webinars, through online services, but they will arrange for local caregivers in the Chicago area, for example, to come and provide support for the caregiver. So I think Ripple is going to be a wonderful program as it develops over the years. It is an 8-year program, test program that Medicare is running. So we'll know at the end of 8 years if it becomes a permanent program or not. But I'd strongly suggest for those of you who are caregivers, you get in touch with Ripple and talk to them about the availability of the plan. So Tess has gone ahead and done that. The other thing we work with caregivers is the assets of the person diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. What assets do they have that could be used to pay for care? Now, in this case, I mentioned to you that Tess's mom lives in her own home, so she could certainly do a reverse mortgage if she wanted to help generate cash flow to pay for her care. She could do an equity loan on her home, although that would be unlikely given her level of income. A reverse mortgage is probably more likely. And then we looked at other assets. I think her mother had a small amount of money in an IRA that could be used, but we wanted to preserve that. That as you use it, as you pull it out of the IRA, it's taxable. So to the extent we could get along on just Tess's mom's Social Security and her pension, and then the money that Tess was earning as a caregiver for her mom being paid by the state of Illinois, we calculated that they would be comfortable at least for a couple of years until the disease progressed even further. With other clients, some clients will have life insurance policies that they've had for years, and many life insurance policies will provide up to half the death benefit for somebody who is terminally or chronically ill. It depends on the policy. I had a client up in Minneapolis, Brian, who had Lou Gehrig's disease. He had a policy, life insurance policy that he bought. I think it was from Allstate for $500,000 that he owned himself. So there, the policy stated that if you're diagnosed with a terminal illness, which he was, ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, is a terminal illness, then at a certain point, they'll pay up to half the death benefit, or $250,000, to help pay for Brian's care. Now, what is the use of that? Because I know the pushback I typically get is the husband or the wife or the couple will tell me this life insurance is not meant to pay for my care. I bought it so that if I die prematurely, my wife or my husband would get a death benefit that would help them live. I tell them that the point isn't whether or not you're going to use it. When I come into a situation where there's a terminally ill husband or wife, there's a lot of anxiety about where are we going to get the money to pay for care. In Brian's case, what his wife wanted to do, her wish was being able to care for Brian in the last few months of his life. She wanted to quit her job and be at home with him. And I told her, my job will be to help find the money so you can do that. Because what I always tell families is, you hopefully will only go through this once. And you don't want to do or not do something where you regret what took place. If she wanted to stay home and take care of them, then I wanted to make that possible. So I told her, with this $250,000 from the life insurance policy, if it becomes necessary, we can use that to help pay for care and get you help, but you can stay home. We don't need your income. Now, as it turns out, Brian died fairly quickly from ALS, and we didn't need to draw on that $250,000. But when we're looking, or when I'm working with a family where somebody is um, is concerned about how to pay for the care, what we do is sit down and go through their assets and decide what's there, if anything, and what can be liquidated to be used to help pay for care. Now, the truth is, for a lot of families, they have very little in the way of assets. But that's what we learn when we do this balance sheet for them. And then I tell them, don't worry, that's now the work begins. Now we'll figure out how to pay for care and what steps are necessary, knowing that you don't have a lot of assets that you can draw on. And that actually becomes a concern. One of the things I was always surprised at in doing this is there is a tension in the family between the ill spouse and the well spouse. The ill spouse's attitude is, don't spend all our money on providing care for me. I don't want to bankrupt the family paying for my care, and then I die. What's my family going to live on? Of course, the family's attitude is, we'll spend whatever's necessary to keep you comfortable. Now, this always surprised me that a lot of times when I would walk in on a family the first time, especially if Alzheimer's had been diagnosed, this had never been talked about before by the family. I've even had families where Alzheimer's, they didn't know it was a terminal disease. I had a client, this is many years ago, 20 years ago. He was a professor at a college, as was his wife. His wife was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's. I think she was maybe 55 when she was diagnosed. That typically means you'll probably die of the disease fairly quickly. But he did not realize that Alzheimer's was a terminal disease. And so I had told him, these are not topics I'm good at discussing. I'm a CPA. I'm not a social worker. I'm not a physician. And I think these issues really need the intervention of a professional like a social worker to help the family talk through and resolve these issues. So I sent, in this case, his name was Craig, back to his wife's doctor to talk to him about the prognosis of the disease, because I don't think it quite registered with Craig what the diagnosis really meant. And also, a social worker can walk into a family situation, as I described, where there's a tension between spending no money on care versus spending money on care. And the person who's ill is worried now in the last few months, how's my family gonna live if they spend all their money? And this is where a good social worker can come in and help the family talk about this and make it a little easier for both sides to recognize where compromises have to be made and what needs to be done to help them get through this situation. Most of what I have found, that when you're dealing with planning for chronic or terminal illnesses, you come up with a list of bad choices, of bad options, and you have to pick the one bad option that's the best from a group of bad options. And I use that analogy to help the family understand what the difficulties are going to be. There are cases I have had where financial issues are compounded by recent bankruptcy. I had a client who was in the North Shore of North Suburbs. He had cancer, very little insurance, so he's still owed quite a bit of money to I think it was North Shore Hospital for his care. And then he was diagnosed with Lou Gehrig's disease. So you can imagine he hadn't even paid off his cancer bill. Now, in this case, a bad thing happened and then a good thing. In this case, I had to turn the family over to a good bankruptcy attorney I had worked with in the past, because that was really the only choice they had, because their mortgage was underwater. They owed more than it was worth. They still owed the hospital quite a bit of money for the cancer treatment received. And the client, well, he sold Empire Carpets, the company that was advertising on TV all the time, and he was a very good salesman. But in this case, his Lou Gehrig's disease started up in his shoulders and impacted his voice first. So a good salesman is only as good as his voice. And so he had to retire fairly quickly after diagnosis and could no longer work. So bankruptcy was the only option. Now, the good thing that happened was his wife was a very well-known pre-kindergarten teacher and had been in the North Suburbs probably for 20 or 30 years. So she had hundreds of kids and hundreds of families that just loved her. When it became known that her husband was diagnosed with ALS, a GoFundMe page was set up, and I think they raised probably close to $90,000 within a couple of weeks, and that money was used to buy a van that would transport my client in a wheelchair. So it was just wonderful, the outpouring of support that this family got. Eventually, they sold their home. They went bankrupt. They were able to find a small home to rent, and then he passed away shortly after that. With chronic illness, with terminal illness, another thing that I have found recently is when I first started studying this area years ago, we always had these very clean models that were unrealistic. In other words, we had typically a husband and a wife with 2 or 3 kids. The husband got sick first. The wife took care of him, and then he died. And then the wife got sick, and usually the daughters took care of her until she died. Well, we all know that life doesn't work that way. Life is very messy. What I've encountered lately is more akin to this, and this involves my brother-in-law and his wife. My brother-in-law is named Gary. He is in the early stages of Alzheimer's disease, probably diagnosed a year or 2 ago. You can tell when you talk to him that he is down, into the moderate phase. His wife, Susan, was diagnosed 5 years ago with ovarian cancer. And she is getting near the end of her journey. She was a nurse and knew something was wrong when she turned 65, but didn't realize it was ovarian cancer. She was diagnosed shortly after going on to Medicare. Now, as she's ending her struggle with the disease, her concern is Gary, because right now, when she's able, because of her, she's not always able to help Gary because her treatments and her energy just aren't there anymore. But she's concerned about what will happen to Gary after she passes away. We tried to tell her not to worry about it. We'll take care of it. She belongs to a wonderful church that is providing just all the help she could need. But my point is, more and more, I'm running into families where it's not one person who is ill and the other person is well and can take care of that person. It's more that both have issues, both are aging, and both need some level of care. So it's become even more important that planning take place all the way from when Susan first went in Gary's wife Susan, first went into Medicare. We knew something was wrong. She turned 65, or she will turn about 4.5 years ago. But knowing that something was wrong, we had enrolled her in a Medicare supplement plan, which I think if you're chronically or terminally ill is a better choice than a Medicare Advantage plan. But she's in a Medicare supplement plan. It's been more expensive in terms of the monthly premiums. On the other hand, all her care expenses have been paid by the Medicare supplement plan. She's been treated at Edwards Hospital, at Elmhurst Hospital. She's now receiving her final treatments at the University of Chicago, but Medicare has picked up all of the expenses, which time and again she tells me she's been so happy with, just because she hasn't had to worry about it. So long-term care planning actually begins with short-term care planning. What Medicare coverage are you going to elect? Are you going to be Medicare Advantage or Medicare Supplement? Where do you want to be treated? And if it's a Medicare Advantage plan, what's the network? If you're in a Medicare Advantage plan, as I mentioned, you won't be eligible for the Alzheimer's Ripple Caregiver Support Program. So you might have to go back to traditional Medicare if you hope to get into that. But all of this is just a way of saying Medicare or healthcare planning begins with short-term, and eventually, as you get older, you're going to be doing more and more long-term care planning. But it's part of a continuum that you have to think about from the time you first go into Medicare till 15, 20 years later when you're faced with a chronic illness. Let's talk briefly about the new treatments that are available for Alzheimer's. These are not cures. They are drugs that can slow the progress of the disease. And so I get a lot of questions, and you'll see them under the second page, bullet point 6, D, where the Kembe was approved a few years ago, and now Kisunla, I have trouble pronouncing that, was approved by the FDA, and that meant Medicare approved use of these drugs through Medicare, and Medicare would pay for them. But Medicare pays for them not through Part D prescription drug plans, but through Part B, which covers doctor office visits, and that also covers when you get infused with a drug. Meaning you either go to the doctor's office to have an IV inserted and the drug's infused in you, or most hospitals nowadays have infusion centers So, for example, I'm infused with a drug every 56 days because I have colitis. And so I go to the Central DuPage Hospital Infusion Center, and then there about 2 or 3 hours while they take care of that. Part B pays for it. So Part B pays 80% of the cost. The other 20% of the cost is paid for by the Medicare supplement plan. So if you're thinking of considering taking either of these drugs, you have to look at the type of coverage you have. As I said, Part B pays 80% of the cost. If you have a Medicare supplement plan, that'll pay the other 20%. But if you have Medicare Advantage, it may or may not pay that other 20% of the cost. So you have to check with the company if you're going to be infused as to whether it will pay the other 20%, not ordinarily paid by Part B. So go to your doctor, ask the doctor. I think I've run into people, I've gone to the doctor. I was actually in one of the medical studies for one of the drugs, but because I take blood thinners, it was decided it was too dangerous for me to actually stay on the test because for people who are on blood thinners, it can actually cause TIA or a mini stroke. So I was tossed off the program. But it's something you should carefully think about and go and talk to your doctor about whether or not he or she recommends the drug. Under bullet point 6F, more than normal aging.lilly.com, I think is a nice site. Lilly is the manufacturer of one of these drugs. They have a lot of benefit, a lot of information for you if you go visit it. So what do we finish up on? We just have a few more minutes. One of the things that I think people don't do enough of is search the internet for financial support for people with chronic or terminal illness. You'd be surprised at what you'll find. So if you go down to bullet 7H, there are private foundations like PAN, which helps support drug costs. And then remember, that's for people who are before Medicare age and after Medicare age. Hilarity for Charity is a foundation started by Seth Rogen. And I think both his parents died with Alzheimer's disease. And it provides funds for caregivers to go for respite care. So you can apply and maybe get a weekend off or a week off. They'll pay for a caregiver. They'll pay for you to go somewhere and kind of relax and not have that constant tension that caregivers have. That was always my biggest fear for my sister and my brother, that their spouses would be overwhelmed with the care responsibilities. Also go to the ACL, the Administration for Community Living.gov. That also has a lot of good information regarding financial support. Finally, a few what ifs when you're planning for Alzheimer's patients' care. What if the caregiver becomes too ill to perform his or her duty? It happens. I had one caregiver who I just started working with. It was two women, them, and before our first meeting, the the caregiver who was in presumably good health died over the weekend suddenly of a heart problem. And now the patient is still alive. Who's going to step in to perform those duties? That is something I always insist family talk about. So again, what if the caregiver dies? Is there a bullpen of caregivers who are willing to step in if something happens where the caregiver either dies or just can't perform his or her duties for a period of time? The other thing I did want to mention just briefly before we conclude, I have a client and her husband who are both over 65. They are going on to Medicare. The problem they have is their daughter, Carrie, is very disabled, age 40, and lives with them. So when we start planning for their transfer to Medicare, we're going to have to figure out what medical coverage is available to their daughter. Obviously, we cannot leave their daughter without coverage. But thank you for your attention. I know it's a lot of information. My phone number, my name and phone number at the end of bottom of page 2, along with my email address. So if you have any questions, please call me or send me a note.